Well, there are obviously a lot of moving pieces with what is happening in Israel right now, the war with Hamas, the possibility of it opening up on multiple fronts. And there is a lot to talk about. U.S. response. Very few people in this world more knowledgeable on this issue than Dan Raviv. He's a freelance journalist, longtime CBS News anchor, reporter, most recently with I-24 News, and a prolific author as well. Spies Against Armageddon, a book you're going to want to particularly pay attention to. You can get that wherever books are sold. It's a history on Israeli intelligence and security agencies, including the Mossad. Dan's a friend, and it's a pleasure to talk to you again, sir. How are you? Thanks for coming on the DC Debrief.
John, I'm glad you do this podcast. And this week, there's a lot of news to talk about.
There is a whole lot of news to talk about. And obviously, the world is looking at what's happening in Israel right now, what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And of course, people are wondering how bad is this going to get? It's already gotten quite bad here over the last week. Israel, as we are recording this, is preparing to send ground troops into Gaza. And for those who don't know what Gaza is like and how densely populated that area of that Middle East region is, it's exceedingly full of people. So how difficult is it going to be for them to go in and target Hamas and their leaders and their militants and differentiate between civilians? How difficult a job is this for the Israeli military?
It's extremely hard for the Israeli military. They're good at what they do, of course, but they've been reluctant to go into Gaza. But something extraordinary happened last weekend, extraordinarily awful, terrible, unforgivable in the Israeli view. They just couldn't possibly turn the other cheek, not at this one. They had always warned that Hamas, that's the extremist Islamic faction of the Palestinians that have ruled Gaza since 2007. For 16 years now, the Israelis have always warned that Hamas is never going to accept an independent Jewish state of Israel. So we just have to, well, box them in effect. And so there's a security fence. Part of it is a concrete wall around Gaza. The Gaza Strip, by the way, which was captured by Israel from Egypt in the 1967 Six-Day War. It's 25 miles long along the Mediterranean. It's very narrow, only about 2 miles, but it is 25 miles long. So it's true that the city of Gaza, which is in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, is extremely crowded. And then at the southern part is what's still called a refugee camp, the Khan Yunis camp, near the Egyptian border. Okay, but in between, there actually is a lot of space. People keep ignoring that again and again this past week after Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu said he advises the people of Gaza City, especially if they live anywhere near Hamas facilities. Netanyahu said, we are going to bomb and destroy them because we're going to destroy Hamas because of what those Hamas gunmen did in Israel last weekend. Again, killing. This is incredible in a country of fewer than 10 million people. 1,300 Israelis, almost all civilians, mutilating their bodies, raping women, torturing children, beheading some babies. And the Israelis actually showed some of those horrible photos to some journalists in Israel just to prove it's true. Hamas is terrible. And then Hamas took about 150 Israelis into Gaza, into the heart of darkness, to hold them as hostages. And it turns out that some of them are United States citizens. Some are European citizens as well as Israelis. And Israel said, we're going to destroy Hamas this time. So when Netanyahu told the people of Gaza, if you're not involved, if you're a civilian, you got to move. Frankly, Israelis don't want to destroy Gaza homes. Yeah. Israelis don't want to kill civilians. But they feel after what happened last weekend, it's unforgivable. So they want to knock Hamas out of power. And one of the questions I know we'll discuss is, so what's the war aim? Like, what's next? But that's the feeling in Israel right now, absolutely determined to do that.
One of the questions other people are asking is, how did Israel's intelligence apparatus, which is so highly regarded, how did they not see this coming? How did they miss this, Dan?
It's amazing. It's really an intelligence failure. That is my special area with Israeli journalist Yossi Melman. I've written 4 books about the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, the best at what they do, but there's still the human factor. If no one is watching the surveillance screens, if no one is taking seriously what they hear in the intercepted conversations, then no one's connecting the dots. Yeah, that could remind you of what happened in this country on 9/11. Not only is it also a massive number of civilians killed, as America suffered on 9/11, but also, well, the failure to see it coming, even though there were some clues. Now, we don't know in full what the clues were. I take it for granted that Israel, that absolutely does monitor almost everything going on in Gaza, heard some conversations, saw some movements, but apparently didn't take it seriously. Only on Thursday did the Israeli army, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, admit that the prior day, on Friday, October 6th, they did see a lot of Hamas people doing some unusual things near the fence, but they didn't think it was that serious. So they didn't add any military patrols. They didn't add even more surveillance. So that's the intelligence failure. Israel only failed that way one time in the past, but it was big. It was exactly 50 years ago. The anniversary, it was October 6, 1973. The anniversary was just last week. The Yom Kippur War, on Judaism's holiest day. That's when Egypt and Syria took Israel by surprise. They even coordinated it. And there, too, an official commission found, kind of a 9/11 commission. Israel had one of those and looked into it and found a host of intelligence failures where Israel thought the Arab countries would never do that. They thought, no, there's no way Egypt and Syria could ever do that. So they didn't take the signs seriously. And Israel was pushed back terribly in the first weeks of the Yom Kippur War, but then came back and won that war and got close to the capitals of both Egypt and Syria. But still, it really hurt. Huge number of casualties. That's where Israel is at now. In the first blow, when Hamas got through what should have been a highly protected border and committed all those atrocities on Israeli territory, that's a humiliation. It's terrible. Israel is in mourning, but determined to hit back.
And it looks like they're about to send ground troops into Gaza, into the Gaza Strip, as I was mentioning a minute ago. But it also looks like that this could turn into a multi-front war, that they could have to also deal with Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon and Syria. What are you hearing about the possibility of that as well?
Well, by the time folks hear this podcast, maybe Israel will have rolled in with a ground invasion. The other fronts that we're thinking about are Jerusalem and the West Bank. That was land captured from Jordan in 1967. I have to underline for people who aren't aware of all the history, there was never an Arab state of Palestine. Even in 1948, when Israel was born, which meant that the British left, the plan approved by the UN was for a Jewish state that the Jews wanted to call Israel and an Arab state that I'm sure they would have called Palestine. But a war broke out when the Arab countries invaded the tiny new state of Israel, and that war lasted almost a year, 1948 to 49. And there were refugees on both sides, but especially Palestinians became refugees. Certainly the Arab side lost that war. Israel became a little bit bigger in 48, but there was never an Arab state of Palestine. No one ever accepted it. So Jordan took the West Bank in the 48 war into 49, and the Egyptians took the Gaza Strip. There was never a Palestine. Well, now Israel is trying at various times to negotiate that there will be a state of Palestine, a two-state solution, Arabs in one state, Jews mostly in another state, but as you know, it keeps failing. So that's one front that could erupt again, where troublemakers in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, the part that the Israelis captured in 1967, could start trouble. It happens from time to time. So that's a matter for the Israeli police and the army and the intelligence to keep an eye out for. Generally, that's manageable. It can be ugly, especially trouble on the Temple Mount, where the gold and silver domed mosques right over the Western Wall, part of the ancient Jewish temple, not far, of course, from where Jesus had his dramatic final days as a person on this earth, all within a mile or so. So, yeah, it's always sensitive. The other front we think about is northern Israel and the border with Lebanon, and it's also a border with Syria, by the way. And in Lebanon, you have the Hezbollah. Hezbollah is clearly a proxy of Iran, taking orders from Iran, money from Iran, arms from Iran. And so that Shiite Muslims in southern Lebanon, they are also determined not to accept Israel or live alongside Israel. And sometimes a war breaks out up there. So what if Iran tells their Hezbollah buddies to start a war up there and bother the Israelis and launch, who knows, again, thousands of rockets, and then the Israeli Iron Dome system and the Patriot system that's been given by the U.S., Iron Dome invented by Israel, an amazing system, would be extremely busy there, extremely busy in the south, as it was this past weekend and still now. those launches from Gaza continue, there's a danger the Iron Dome system is going to be overwhelmed by all those launches. So here's part of what's going on. The United States, the Biden administration, couldn't be friendlier to Israel after what happened last weekend, just could not be more supportive. I mean, there may be listeners and viewers of this podcast who think, Donald Trump is better for Israel, Joe Biden, he's whatever. You can argue about things, but since last weekend, unbelievable. Joe Biden's pro-Israel speeches, sending Secretary of State Tony Blinken on a largely emotional visit with victims in Israel, but also moving ships. The USS Gerald Ford is an aircraft carrier and its battle group much closer to the coastline of Lebanon, Israel, and Gaza. What's the U.S. message? A, they're there to evacuate any Americans or hostages who might be freed. That's good. But also the message is to Iran and Hezbollah, don't start trouble in the north. John, I see it as conceivable that American battleships actually would shell Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. Wow. If Iran and Hezbollah try to get involved in this war, I think the U.S. would see it as a U.S. national interest to do so.
Yeah, it's for everything you've heard from the president and from Blinken has been unwavering support. Prime Minister Netanyahu has praised the Biden administration for their handling and their messaging so far. We've seen John Kirby very emotional on television and at the news conferences with some of the pictures and scenes that have come out for sure. And I guess
cover on this podcast all the time, which is what does Congress do?
Yeah.
What does Congress think? Almost unanimous. Very support for Israel. Very few members of the Democratic Party who never liked Israel, who think Israel causes trouble and human rights violations. They're not saying much. The vast majority supportive. And with a Speaker of the House installed, one hopes that Congress can get itself together. And if they want to approve more aid for Israel, for instance, that'll happen. I mean, you don't want to see the American Congress paralyzed.
Yeah. And of course, we're waiting for a Speaker of the House to be voted on by House Republicans. Until then, the Congress is largely paralyzed with what they can do. So obviously, that's a part of this story that we're also covering. But I want to get back to Hamas and the motivation for Hamas, because Hamas launches this attack. They know Israel will respond. They know Israel will respond forcefully. What's the goal? What's the end game for Hamas here? What is... Obviously, they want to cause death and they want to cause destruction and they want to hit out at the Zionist threat as they see it. But what's the end game for them in all of this?
Well, first, it is part of their mission and their interpretation of what Islam calls for, that if they have a chance to kill Jewish people, whether it's grandmothers or whether it's babies, they'll do it. We saw that this past Saturday. It was astounding when confronted with children and families in their apartments or in shelters. They would just spray bullets and kill them all or set fire to the house. So that is in their ideology, to kill Jews. Now, the political side of that is these Jews, as they see it, are occupying part of Palestine. The Hamas view is there should not be a Jewish state at all. Forget about that United Nations plan of 1947 or whatever the British had in mind in 48. They don't think there should be a Jewish state of Israel at all. So kill anybody you can possibly get to, make life impossible in Israel, make life unpleasant, make the Israelis depressed. And for now, Hamas managed to do that. But you're right, John. They also made the Israelis angry and determined. And of course, Hamas knew that Israel would hit back hard. Yeah. Now, does Hamas care when many, many, many Gaza civilians are killed, or does it fuel their revolutionary fervor? I would say the latter. They don't care much. Deaths among the Gaza population are good for the Hamas message in hoping that Israel will be blamed, Israel will be unpopular, and they dream that one day Israel won't exist. I'm sure they even would hope that Iran would get nuclear bombs and use one.
Yeah. Last question here for you then, Dan. So the possibility of a two-state solution has always been out there. You referred to it just a second ago. It has really, I don't think, ever seemed further away than it does right at this minute. It seems inconceivable that a two-state solution could happen at this point, but that is obviously still the goal of most people who have been watching the Middle East and trying to find a way to end this conflict that's been going on for generations. If you had the answer to this question, it would be a lot easier to solve it. But how can there be a two-state solution? What has to happen in order for that to be an eventuality someday?
Step one, remove Hamas. Because don't get confused, dear listeners. You may think, oh my, what the Israelis are doing, plowing into Gaza, that makes a solution less possible. Deaths are terrible. I hope Israel keeps expressing regret when civilians are hit. But eliminating Hamas, if Israel can manage to do that, topple that regime, remove Hamas, and then Israel hands the keys to Gaza. Israel got out of Gaza, by the way, in 2005, but hands the keys now to the Palestinian Authority, which is relatively moderate, based in Ramallah in the West Bank. It's Yasser Arafat's old Al-Fatah group,
Mm-hmm.
but they are definitely more moderate. They have signed agreements with Israel. They would live alongside Israel. And then the prospect that Saudi Arabia, the European Union, and others might pour in money, and you build a port, you get the airport going, the fishing industry gets good. I mean, Gaza is good land. And if the Palestinian Authority would play ball, and they might welcome the opportunity, because Hamas chased them away in 2007 in a bloody civil war between Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority may be happy to come back. Israel may be able to hand the keys back to the PA. I'm not saying there'd be an instant solution, but that's a step not away from a two-state solution, Palestine alongside Israel. That actually could be a step forward.
Well, like I said, no one better to talk about these issues in this area of the world than Dan Raviv. Want to encourage you to get his book, Spies Against Armageddon. Again, a history of Israeli intelligence and security agencies. This is an area that we are obviously going to be focusing on a whole lot, and Dan has written a lot about it. So you can check out any one of his different books on Amazon, wherever it is that you can find things to read. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the DC Debrief and helping to unpack all this for us. We really appreciate it.
John, it's a dark time, but good to talk to you.